This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Chip in Tampa, Florida, on March the 30th, 2006. The Return of the Native by Thomas Hardy. Chapter 3. The Custom of the Country. Had a looker-on been posted in the immediate vicinity of the barrow, he would have learned that these persons were boys and men of the neighboring hamlets. Each, as he ascended the barrow, had been heavily laden with furze faggots, carried upon the shoulder by means of a long stake, sharpened at each end for impaling them easily, two in front and two behind. They came from a part of the heath a quarter of a mile to the rear, where furze almost exclusively prevailed as a product. Every individual was so involved in furze by his method of carrying the faggots that he appeared like a bush on legs till he had thrown them down. The party had marched in trail, like a travelling flock of sheep, that is to say, the strongest first, the weak and young behind. The loads were all laid together, and a pyramid of furze 30 feet in circumference now occupied the crown of the tumulus, which was known as Rain Barrow for many miles around. Some made themselves busy with matches, and in selecting the driest tufts of furze; others in loosening the bramble bonds which held the faggots together. Others, again, while this was in progress, lifted their eyes and swept the vast expanse of country commanded by their position, now lying nearly obliterated by shade. In the valleys of the heath, nothing save its own wild face was visible at any time of day; but this spot commanded a horizon enclosing a tract of far extent, and in many cases lying beyond the heath country. None of its features could be seen now, but the whole made itself felt as a vague stretch of remoteness. While the men and lads were building the pile, a change took place in the mass of shade which denoted the distant landscape. Red suns and tufts of fire, one by one, began to arise, flecking the whole country round. They were the bonfires of the other parishes and hamlets that were engaged in the same sort of commemoration. Some were distant, and stood in a dense atmosphere, so that bundles of pale straw-like beams radiated around them in the shape of a fan. Some were large and near, glowing scarlet red from the shade like wounds in a black hide. Some were Menades, with whiny faces and blown hair. These tinctured the silent bosom of the clouds above them, and lit up their ephemeral caves, which seemed thenceforth to become scalding cauldrons. Perhaps as many as 30 bonfires could be counted within the whole bounds of the district, and as this hour may be told on a clock face when the figures themselves are invisible, so did the men recognize the locality of each fire by its angle and direction, though nothing of the scenery could be viewed. The first tall flame from Rain Barrow sprang into the sky, attracting all eyes that had been fixed on the distant conflagrations back to their own attempt in the same kind. The cheerful blaze streaked the inner surface of the human circle, now increased by other stragglers, male and female, with its own gold livery, and even overlaid the dark turf around with a lively luminescence, which softened off into obscurity where the barrow rounded downwards out of sight. It showed the barrow to be a segment of the globe, as perfect as on the day when it was thrown up, even the little ditch remaining from which the earth was dug. Not a plough had ever disturbed a grain of that stubborn soil. In the heath's barrenness to the farmer lay its fertility to the historian. There had been no obliteration, because there had been no tending. It seemed as if the bonfire makers were standing in some radiant upper story of the world, detached from and independent of the dark stretches below. The heath down there was now a vast abyss, and no longer a continuation of what they stood on, for their eyes, adapted to the blaze, could see nothing of the deeps beyond its influence. Occasionally, it is true, a more vigorous flare than usual from their faggots sent darting lights like aides de camp down the inclines to some distant bush, pool, or patch of white sand, kindling these to replies of the same colour, till all was lost in darkness again. Then the whole black phenomenon beneath resembled limbo as viewed from the brink by the sublime Florentine in his vision, and the muttered articulations of the wind in the hollows were as complaints and petitions from the souls of mighty worth suspended therein. It was as if these men and boys had suddenly dived into past ages, and fetched therefrom an hour and deed which had before been familiar with this spot. The ashes of the original British pyre which blazed from that summit lay fresh and undisturbed in the barrow beneath their tread. The flames from funeral piles long ago kindled there had shone down upon the lowlands as these were shining now. Festival fires to Thor and Woden had been followed on the same ground, and duly had their day. Indeed, it is pretty well known that such blazes as this the heathmen were now enjoying are rather the lineal descendants from jumbled druidical rites and Saxon ceremonies than the invention of popular feeling about gunpowder plot. Moreover, to light a fire is the instructive and resistant act of man when, at the winter ingress, the curfew is sounded throughout nature. It indicates a spontaneous Promethean rebelliousness against that fiat that this recurrent season shall bring foul times, cold darkness, misery, and death. Black chaos comes, and the fettered gods of earth say, "Let there be light." The brilliant lights and sooty shades which struggled upon the skin and clothes of the persons standing round caused their lineaments and general contours to be drawn with Düreresque vigour and dash. Yet the permanent moral expression of each face it was impossible to discover, for, as the nimble flames towered, nodded, and swooped through the surrounding air, the blots of shade and flakes of light upon all countenances of the group changed shape and position endlessly. All was unstable, quivering as leaves, evanescent as lightning. Shadowy eye sockets, deep as those of a death's head, suddenly turned into pits of lustre. A lantern jaw was cavernous, then it was shining. Wrinkles were emphasized into ravines, or obliterated entirely by a changed ray. Nostrils were dark wells. Sinews in old necks were gilt mouldings. Things with no particular polish on them were glazed. Bright objects, such as the tip of the furze hook one of the men carried, were as glass. Eyeballs glowed like little lanterns. Those whom nature had depicted as merely quaint became grotesque. The grotesque became preternatural, for all was in extremity. Hence it may be that the face of an old man who had, like others, been called to the heights by the rising flames, was not really the mere nose and chin that it appeared to be, but an appreciable quantity of human countenance. He stood complacently sunning himself in the heat, with a speaker or a stake. He tossed the outlying scraps of fuel onto the conflagration, looking at the midst of the pile, occasionally lifting his eyes to measure the height of the flame, or to follow the great sparks which rose with it and sailed away into the darkness. The beaming sight and the penetrating warmth seemed to breed in him a cumulative cheerfulness, which soon amounted to delight. With his stick in his hand, he began to jig a private minuet. A bunch of copper seals, shining and swinging like a pendulum from under his waistcoat, he also began to sing, in the voice of a bee up a flue. The king called down his nobles all, by one, by two, by three. Earl Marshal, I'll go shrive the queen, and thou shalt wend with me. A boon, quoth Earl Marshal, and fell on bended knee, that whatsoe'er the queen shall say, no harm thereof may be. Want of breath prevented a continuance of the song, and the breakdown attracted the attention of a firm-standing man of middle age, who kept each corner of his crescent-shaped mouth rigorously drawn back into his cheek, as if to do away with any suspicion of mirthfulness which might erroneously have attached to him. "A fair stave, Grandfriar Cantal, but I'm afraid 'tis too much for the mouldy weasand of such an old man as you," he said to the wrinkled reveller. "Doesn't wish the was 3 6s again, grandfather, as you was when you first learned to sing it." "Eh?" said Grandfather Cantal, stopping in his dance. "Don't wish 'twast young again, I say. There's a hole in thy poor bellows nowadays, seemingly." "Ah, but there's good art in me. If I couldn't make a little wind to go a long ways, I should seem no younger than the most aged man, should I, Timothy?" "And how about the new married folks down there at the Quiet Woman Inn?" the other inquired, pointing towards a dim light in the direction of the distant highway, but considerably apart from where the Reddleman was at that moment resting. "What's the rights on the matter about them? You ought to know, being an understanding man." "But a little rakish, eh? I own to it. Master Cantal is that, or he's nothing. Yet 'tis a gay fault, neighbour Fairway. That age will cure." "I heard that they were coming home tonight. By this time they must have come. What besides?" "The next thing is for us to go and wish 'em joy, I suppose." "Well, no. No? Now I thought we must, or 'twould be very unlike me, the first in every spree that's going. Do thou put on a friar's coat, and I'll put on another, and we will to Queen Eleanor go, like friar and his brother. I met Mistress Yobite, the young bride's aunt, last night, and she told me that her son Clym was coming home a Christmas. Wonderful clever, I believe. Ah, I should like to have all that's under that young man's hair. Well, then, I spoke to her in my well-known merry way, and she said, 'Oh, what's shaped so venerable could talk like a fool?' That's what she said to me. I don't care for her, be jowned if I do, and so I told her, 'Be jowned if I care for ye,' I said. I had her there, eh?" "I rather think she had you," said Fairway. "No," said Grandfriar Cantal, his countenance slightly flagging. "'Tisn't so bad as that with me." "Seemingly 'tis. However, it is because of the wedding that Clym is coming home a Christmas, to make a new arrangement, because his mother is now left in the house alone?" Yes, that's it. But, Timothy, hearken to me," said the Grandfriar earnestly. "Though known as such a joker, I be an understanding man, if you catch me serious, and I am serious now. I can tell 'ee lots about the married couple. Yes, this morning at 6 o'clock they went up the country to do the job, and neither Vel nor Mark have been seen of 'em since, though I reckon that this afternoon has brought 'em home again, man and woman. Wife, that is. Isn't it spoke like a man, Timothy? And wasn't Miss Yeobright wrong about me?" "Yes, it will do. I don't know the two had walked together since last fall, when her aunt forbade the banns. How long has this new set to been in mangling, then? Do you know, Humphrey?" "Yes, how long?" said Grandfriar Cantal smartly, likewise turning to Humphrey. "I ask that question." "Ever since her aunt altered her mind and said she might have the man after all," replied Humphrey, without removing his eyes from the fire. He was a somewhat solemn young fellow, and carried the hook and leather gloves of a furs cutter, his legs, by reason of that occupation, being sheathed in bulging leggins, as stiff as the Philistines' greaves of brass. "That's why they went away to be married, I count. You see, after kicking up such a nunny watch and forbidding the banns, 'twould made Mistress Yeobright seem foolish like to have a banging wedding in the same parish, as if she'd never gainsaid it." "Exactly. Seems foolish like, and that's very bad for the poor things that be so, although I only guess as much, to be sure," said Grandfriar Cantle, still strenuously preserving a sensible bearing and mien. "Ah, well, I was at church that day," said Fareway, "which was a very curious thing to happen." "If 'twasn't, my name's Simple," said the Grandfriar emphatically. "I ain't been there t' year, and now the winter's a coming on, I won't say I shall." "I hadn't been these 3 years," said Humphrey, "for I'm so dead sleepy of a Sunday, and 'tis so terrible far to get there, and when you do get there, 'tis such a mortal poor chance that you'll be chose up for above, when so many bain't, that I bide my time at home, and don't go at all." "I not only happened to be there," said Fareway, with a fresh collection of emphasis, "but I was sitting in the same pew as Mrs. Yeobright, and though you might not see it as such, it fairly made my blood run cold to hear her. Yes, it is a curious thing, but it made my blood run cold, for I was close at her elbow." The speaker looked round at the bystanders, now drawing closer to him, with his lips gathered tighter than ever in the rigorousness of his descriptive moderation. "'Tis a serious job to have things to e'en there," said a woman behind. "Ye are to declare it," was the parson's words, Fareway continued, "and then up stood a woman at my side, a touching of me. Well, be damned if it wasn't Mrs. Yeobright a standing up. I said to myself, 'Yes, neighbours,' though I was in the temple of prayer, that's what I said. ''Tis against my conscience to curse and swear in company, and I hope any woman here will overlook it. Yes, still, what I did say, and 'twould be a lie if I didn't own it." "So 'twould, neighbour Fareway. Be damned if there isn't Mrs. Yeobright a standing up, I said," the narrator repeated, giving out the bad word with the same passionless severity of face as before, which proved how entirely necessity and not gusto had to do with the iteration. "And the next thing I heard was, 'I forbid the banns from her.' I'll speak to you after the service," said the parson in quite a homely way, yes, turning all at once into a common man no holier than you or I. Ah, her face was pale. Maybe you can call to mind that monument in Weatherbury Church, the cross-legged soldier that hath his arm knocked away by the school children. Well, he would have matched that woman's face when she said, 'I forbid the banns.'" The audience cleared their throats and tossed a few stalks into the fire, not because these deeds were urgent, but to give themselves time to weigh the moral of the story. "I'm sure that when I heard they'd been forbid, I felt as glad as if anyone had gied me sixpence," said an earnest voice, that of Ollie Dowden, a woman who lived by making heath brooms or besoms. Her nature was to be civil to enemies as well as to friends, and grateful to all the world for letting her remain alive. "And now the maid have married him just the same," said Humphrey. "After that, Mrs. Yeobright came round and was quite agreeable," Fareway resumed, with an unheeding air. to show that his words were no appendage to Humphrey's, but the result of independent reflection. "Supposing they were ashamed, I don't see why they shouldn't ha' done it here, right?" said a wide-spread woman whose stays creaked